I mean, I've got some stuff too. No, not.
All right, ladies and gentlemen, if you'll take your seats, I know people are still coming in from outside, but we have a full day, so we're just going to go ahead and kick it off. There were many. The throngs are coming in from outside. Okay, we have a critical mass. It's early, but good morning, everybody. I'm Michael Scharf. I am the co-interim dean of Case Western Reserve University School of Law, but today I'm here in a different capacity. I'm here as the co-president of the Canada-U.S. Law Institute to help kick off this wonderful conference, and you'll be hearing from my co-president from the North, Dean Ian Scott, in just a minute. I just want to say that this law school is so proud and excited to be hosting once again this annual conference. It's hard to believe that we've been doing this since 1976. That's 39 uninterrupted years of Canada-U.S. Law Institute conferences. And what's a little scary is some of the people I see out in the audience may have been there way back then. Not really. This is a much younger crowd than we've had in the past. We named this conference after Henry T. King, who was a former Nuremberg prosecutor and a long-term professor of our law school for 30 years, and he ran the Canada-U.S. Law Institute as its chair, and we just do this in his because it is his spirit that imbibes this conference. The Canada-U.S. Law Institute is very important to this law school. It's a component of our thriving international law program. A lot of you come to our conferences and lectures that we have throughout the year. We were very excited that U.S. News and World Report just released the most recent rankings of international law programs, and Case Western was ranked number 11 in the United States, ahead of Stanford, Cornell, and University of Virginia. And thank you. And that's in part due to these wonderful conferences that we have. So this conference is a hot topic, and I don't think last year when the executive committee was meeting, we had any idea how hot this topic was going to become. Because of its salience and timeliness, we have been able to attract really stellar panelists and some standalone keynote speakers. So last night we had an amazing speech by John Melly, the Deputy U.S. Trade Representative. Today's morning keynote speech is going to be James Dickmeyer, who joins us once again. He's the Consul General of the United States too. We have an all-star response panel to his speech with Ambassador David Jacobson, who's back with us, and Governor and Ambassador James Blanchard and Minister Jim Peterson. The two of them you'll see later, but they are the co-chairs of our executive committee. Our afternoon keynote is Gary Dewar, the Canadian ambassador to the United States, and again, we're really lucky that he's been able to rejoin us after having spoken at our conferences in the past. And then our closing keynote is Stuart Baker from Steptoe & Johnson, the former general counsel of the NSA, and he'll have some interesting words about the digital border and national security threats. We are webcasting live this year. Probably several hundred people are watching live. We'll get as many as 1,000 people watch after the fact. So, you know, do be conscious of that when you're talking here. You're talking to a worldwide audience. You do need to wait if you're asking questions from the audience till you are handed the microphone. Otherwise, nobody around the world will be able to hear you. I want to also thank our executive committee and our advisory board who's been meeting for the last 2 days to come up with next year's topic, which is going to be on the international trade issue. And I also want to recognize our national directors from the Canadian side, Kai Carmody, back there, who does so much, including writing this year's Niagara Moot Court competition problem. And from the United States side, Charlie Corismo. Charlie is there. And Charlie, along with his assistant, Emily Gibbons, have done a whole lot of the background work to pull off this conference and make it possible. And also Nancy Pratt and Ray Utrep and their team that have done the logistics work, and you saw them on the way out. So I'm going to turn it over to Dean Scott for a few final words off the program. Thank you all for coming.
Thank you, Michael. He has to write my notes for me. I'm delighted in years that the Canada name still precedes the United States name in the title of our organization. That might be a remarkable achievement in and of itself. It's my pleasure to be here. I also wanted to thank our co-chairs, Mr. Peterson and Governor Blanchard. I can assure you in my 4 years that I've been associated with this organization that their leadership has been both committed and energetic and, quite frankly, instrumental in our continuing success. So I'm really deeply appreciative of that. Western University, through the Faculty of Law, is delighted to be a part of this institute. I was not so sure about it when I first showed up, but I have now seen over the years the importance and the continuing importance of all the very many cross-border issues that we face, our two countries. So the discussions we will have today and hopefully plan for next year, I think it will be even bigger and better. And we are prepared at our institution to continue to support this organization. We're delighted that Charlie's taken over on the Case Western side, and we've had Charlie up to speak to our faculty, and I think there's lots more that we can do together to make this a very successful both conference and future for our organization. So on behalf of Western Law, I thank you all for coming. I also have it's my pleasure to thank the Canadian government through their consulate for their support for the conference, DLA Piper, who have been a very generous supporter, and now, of course, with their move into Canada, with the acquisition of a Canadian law firm, will no doubt continue their support. Baker Hostetler firm and the Council on the Great Lakes region were also sponsors. With that, I believe I turn it over to Minister Peterson.
Thanks, Ian. Before I start, I would like to recognize someone in our audience today, Dan Usho, who ran this operation for so many years and was part of its great success. Dan, thank you very much for your continuing interest here. When Ian started off and said that the Canadian name on our logo precedes that of our great friend of the South, I guess he was saying that it's like the first name, but really the family name comes second. And this is really part of the paranoia that many Canadians have about the Canada-U.S. relationship. So often we feel either neglected or undervalued or ignored. But quelling these fears of paranoia, etc., about our great relationship is the fact that the United States has sent diplomats of the very highest order to Canada to deal with us. And that speaks mountains about the relationship between our two countries. Jimmy Blanchford from 93 to 96, David Jacobson from 2009 to 2013, and today, Consul General Jim Dickmeyer, who joined us as Consul General in 2012. I had the pleasure of meeting Jim very soon after his arrival in Canada and was immediately struck by his charm, his graciousness, his warmth. Very big fellow, very big heart. But I was particularly pleased, personally, by the fact that he and I share the first name, and our wives share the name Heather. And this meant that I was not going to have great problems with my forgetting names as far as the relationship with this guy went. He has had a very distinguished career, 29 years in the U.S. diplomatic corps, serving in 6 different countries, Latin America, speaking Spanish and Portuguese. He taught at the National Defense Unit in Washington, and for 2 years he was director of the State Department's Foreign Press Centers in Washington and New York, where he controlled and pistol whipped over 3,000 foreign journalists to the U.S. I have to say this to you, Jim. You have made a great impression on those with whom you've worked in Canada. Your term is coming to an end this August, much to the regret of those of us who have had the privilege and pleasure of working with you. You've been a great credit to your country, and you've been a great friend to Canada, and we're going to do everything we can to extend your term. And thank you for being with us today.
Well, that's tough when you have such a distinguished person giving you such a wonderful introduction. And then I'm hearing that there are thousands of people out there in the world listening to this, and it's pretty daunting. It was even more daunting when I saw that the people that were going to comment or were going to be part of the panel of this were the 3 honorables, I call them, because they all deserve that title, honorable, because of their positions in public service. But with David Jacobson, Jim Blanchard, and Jim Peterson are going to talk afterwards. And so I thought, I'm in trouble or I got it made. And I'm going to decide I've got it made because I was talking with Ambassador Jacobson, and he said he had my back. If I stumble anytime, I could turn right to him and he'd come in and fill in. That happened during all my time when I was at the consulate in Toronto and he was in Ottawa. There's another little housekeeping matter. I learned that Emily did not get her spring break. She was working on the conference, and so I promised to negotiate, as good diplomats do. And Emily, the dean, says you do get next week off. Supposedly I have to provide the ticket, but we'll work that out. You can come up to Toronto. Spring is breaking out there. As I thought about what to talk about and to use this time well, it's difficult because there's so much within the relationship to talk about. Clearly, the issues that are going to be discussed later in terms of cybersecurity and intellectual property protections are hugely important. But I'd like to talk today and lay some discussion groundwork on what I think is, history will show, one of the most important agreements reached between Canada and the United States, and that's the Beyond the Border vision and the work plan that was launched in early 2011 by Prime Minister Harper and President Obama, and the work plan started in earnest at the end of 2011. What does it do? It's distinct in my career and agreements in that it is very specific, it has goals, it has a report card at the end of each year, and I was just able to read a draft of the one that will come out that reports on 2014, which is kind of the final year of the 3 years of the original plan, the work plan. I was worried that there wasn't going to be continuity after. There is going to be, and this report certainly indicates that, and some of the discussion that happened from the working group that met in Ottawa in last fall indicates that definitely this will continue. Why do I think it's far-reaching? It takes a bunch of the issues that we know we need to work on, and it puts it in a structure in which the White House and the Privy Council and the PMO are saying, we're watching progress. We have people here that are going to be meeting regularly, going to be checking back with the broad bureaucracies that are working on this, and we're going to ask for results. Secondly, it says stakeholders have a big play in this. And go out and talk to stakeholders, bring in their ideas, and they have power in this process. And the vision is what? The vision is that we can provide for common security of our peoples and at the same time work at facilitating greater and easier movement of people and goods across the border. I'm not a big fan of the term thickening a border, but what we're trying to do is say that border, it exists. As Minister Peterson said, we are still two sovereign countries. We have not decided to give up our sovereignty, and that's an important issue that I think we often lose in this discussion. Stakeholders often lose when they kind of say, well, just, you know, fix that part of the border. Make, you know, you don't need this, you don't need that. We're two sovereign countries. We have our laws and regulations, and that's an important thing to keep in mind as we, in fact, cede to each other certain considerations within our sovereignty as we go through the beyond the border. And I'll talk about some of that as I go along a bit. And I think we can only do that because we can only do that of certain parts of our sovereignty, combining perhaps better our sovereignty because of the long history of trust. But even with that long history, I think I certainly minimize the tough that it is in changing cultures, and I'm talking specifically bureaucratic cultures. How hard it is to get different groups that are working basically on the same thing. We can talk about Health Canada and USDA, and what they're trying to do is protect the health, well-being of the citizens of each of their countries. They pretty much are working off the same science. This is I promise not an example, but Master Jacobson introduced it, and it's been used now forever, but the Cheerios example, and the formulas for Cheerios. And they're different, and they came at being different by two different bureaucracies, pretty much working with the same science, but working with different publics, different cultures. So the seemingly, you know, simplistic, logical, just pick a formula, well, in fact, that has to overcome certain kind of cultural strengths and feelings within each country. The idea that we're asking basically at the border law enforcement authorities to be trade facilitators is also a cultural shift, is also asking them to do something different than really what they're trained to do and what they signed up to do. So as we are at the border and we're telling the people at CBSA and CBP, you've got to be smart about how you screen. Yes, you're responsible for the safety and security, but you're also responsible for moving people through quickly. That's a tough challenge. So they have to have the tools. And that's where the Beyond the Border vision has then moved to something that Ambassador Doer was in Washington. Was it Monday? Just Monday? Jeez. Where pre-clearance agreement signed. That pre-clearance adds to the tools that our people on the front lines have to be creative, to actually go and try some things out. And I'm going to talk a bit about some pilot programs, because what the pilot programs, what the Beyond the Border structure has given, what the pre-clearance agreement is going to give even more, is space, gives top cover for bureaucrats to be more creative. And one of the ways, easy ways for a bureaucrat to be creative is to call something a pilot project. Nobody gets fearful of the term project because they think it can die, it's going to go away. And so you call it a pilot project and you go out and you launch it. I heard someone from the White House staff, from the national security staff, call this is basically it's our way to be able to test hypotheses. And many of these tests are coming from the stakeholders. So again, back to that area where the stakeholders can have some input in how they go about, how we go about testing improvements on the border. One of the ways we were looking at, and again, I'm stealing from Ambassador Jacobs, and most of my good lines are from him, so he won't have anything left when he gets up here, but I am. Okay, these two together, yeah, the team. But one is the tracking of people who are exiting our countries. So we tracked, obviously, people who enter our countries. And the simple thing is, do we set up separate things on the border to track people who leave? And somebody got smart and said, let's exchange the information of those who enter our countries, and that will tell you who's left your country, at least on that border area. Simple. Not really. You have privacy concerns. You have all kinds of different kinds of laws and so on controlling the exchange of information about citizens. We haven't yet started that part of it on citizens. It's on third country nationals. They're back and forth. But there are also technological problems. How do you match up the systems in the databases? How do you protect that information? Who gets at that information? All these different protocols and regimens were tried out, and it's moving along. And then the next idea is that, again, this is the publics are going to have to be sensitized to this and pretty much come along, is we'll do it for everybody, including U.S. and Canadian back and forth. That is out there in the proposal. That's one small one. A big one was the integrated cargo security strategy and these pilot projects, which basically says, Prince Rupert, a cargo container can come off a ship from Japan. It's checked by the Canadian authorities with agreed upon protocols that we've all worked out. And that cargo van can then travel east in any path it wants within the U.S. and Canada. In essence, taking advantage of more logical transportation path for that particular cargo load. Instead of 2 hours, if it were to cross into the United States at Duluth, instead of 2 hours, it's now 20 minutes. And a lot of that has to do with technology. It has to do with receiving information. It has to do with agreeing to the protocols. What information are we seeking? How do we keep it together, and how do we keep it secure? And how do we keep those loads secure? Here's an interesting thing about pilots, testing hypotheses. So if you talk to the DHS guys, this pilot worked great as far as the security element of it. They're assured that it's working well. You talk to USDA, it didn't work because there are wood pallets in these loads, and wood pallets can have pests. And they've got to figure out a way to check for the pests coming into the United States. So it shows how many different people are involved in this, different agencies. I was told by a CBP officer that they represent 40 U.S. agencies when they're sitting there at the border in terms of different elements that they have to enforce or look for in terms of U.S. laws and regulations. 40. I suspect it's an equal load for CBSA. So that particular pilot's back to the drawing board a bit, figuring out that element of a new requirement or how they're going to deal with that. But they were able to test a hypothesis, and as far as the security side of stuff, it worked. The pre-inspection pilots. One of the big arguments, one of the big complaints you get is infrastructure is old, infrastructure is limited. On some of the bridges that go across, you've got land, empty land on one side, and you're totally filled up. No room to expand if you want to add extra truck cargo space on the other. Take the Peace Bridge, that's the perfect example. That's where one of the pilots was tried out. On the Canadian side, there's some extra land as you're approaching the bridge. Any of you have gone across that bridge, as often just one lane is filled with crawling trucks, a lot of the times. So what they decided to try was we can, in essence, create 2 more truck inspection booths on the Canadian side in that piece of land. Logical. There's land. Well, wait a minute. CBP officers at borders doing their duties carry a firearm. So does CBSA, by the way. But do CBP officers doing their duty on the border, standing in Canada, carry their firearm? That's a big issue. Obviously, a huge issue. How do you get all of the data infrastructure set up? What connections do you make? And then, most importantly, is you've inspected a truck in this little spot here. That truck eventually then joins the other vehicles that get into the bridge. And how do you make sure that truck is the one, when it rolls up at the U.S. side, basically the idea of that pre-inspection is that truck just keeps kind of slowly going through the inspection because he shows something. When I watched the thing, it was a pink piece of paper. I didn't think that was too secure. Somebody could have a whole bunch of paper and figure out what color they were using that day for pre-inspection. But I think they improved on that. But the idea is you show that and you keep rolling through. You're moving trucks through faster. But still a challenge. So the pilots have ended. Both sides are looking at that, at the pilot, deciding how that might work in different places and different areas where there were particular problems. And there were costs involved with that. And do you absorb those costs? Those are just 3 of kind of many pilots, and I think we'll see a lot more coming forward. And some of them, one I'll mention that is now successfully implemented and expanding, is the shipwriter. And it was a pilot, started about 3 years ago out west, and then they did another in the Detroit-Windsor area. They are now operational. I was talking with the Admiral last night, Coast Guard Admiral, and they're now going to expand in other places across the border. How does that work? It's basically law enforcement, in this case RCMP from the U.S. Coast Guard from the U.S. side are on the ship together. They've trained together, gone through a 3-week course, figured out in terms of learning about each other's laws and procedures and so on, done some exercises together. So when they're on a ship, if they're on the Canadian side, the senior Canadian officer is in charge, and everybody else is under his or her authority, and they're deputized, and if they need to make an arrest or a stop, they all know how to do it. If they're on the U.S. side, same thing. Senior U.S. officers in charge, they know how to make the stop. What's the advantage? Clearly, you're joining together forces. You are patrolling a body of water that we share jointly, and you don't allow the bad guys to just escape justice by crossing a border on the water. It also just signals something to people who want to engage in criminal enterprise, which is the 2 sides are really joined together. And so this isn't just guys sitting on ships. It's information sharing. It's all kinds of other stuff that works. That is a successful pilot that's now being expanded. And again, when you talk about the types of trust and put law enforcement officers together, and at any point in time, one side says, "You're my commander," and as the water, you cross a certain part of the water, you say, "You're my commander." That is an amazing cultural shift. That is an amazing progress when you think about how you can take resources and no longer have this line of sovereignty say, no, no, no. You can take these resources and now you have room to say, can we join them in some way or another? And that's the way I think it's working. I want to talk real briefly about another, I guess I'd call it an example of how well this can work, and it's partially the technology that has done it. So when I arrived in Toronto in 2012, in August, they had just gone horrible summer out at Pearson Airport in terms of the volumes had gone up tremendously. And the CBP operation there in did not have enough officers, and there were just and the officer then in charge, the CBP officer in charge of the port director as they're called, out at Pearson, had worked hard, had tried to get some extra resources from Washington. But his great success, and it's not, I'm not minimizing it, it was a success, but his great success was getting the airport to designate a certain area that was a more comfortable waiting area for the overflow. Because he didn't have a way to deal with the overflow. You fast forward now, and those of you who've gone through Pearson, you will see that with the increased number of Nexus machines, and I'll talk a little bit about Nexus, and with the introduction of the other machines that read U.S. and Canadian passports, and you move through that way, there are very few lines. The waiting time has been reduced by, let me get that number because I want it right, has been reduced by 70% from 2012 to now. Peak time, waiting time at Pearson Airport to get through the pre-clearance area in 2012 was 1 to 1.5 hours. At the peak now, your longest waiting time is 15 to 20 minutes. Why is that happening? Because 83% of passengers going through there use technology. 13% use a Nexus card. We all understand the Nexus, and that particular program started long ago. But it has been refined now, and there are 1.1 million holders of Nexus cards. You go to Pearson, or you can certainly use it on the border to facilitate your passage through. The idea is that you've been pre-screened. The border guards are less worried about you because you've gone through that. They're more focused on trying to find other people who may not be such good guys. And you put in your passport or put in your card, you punch on the screen, you pull out your slip, you walk straight over to going through then security at Pearson. If you're at the other machines, the APC machines, the advanced passenger system, you screen in your passport, and I think we all need to remember, and I wasn't here as much as you, but the fights that went on in the United States and in Canada about getting those passports. And then some of the discussion about what was going to be the standard for the chips and the other things and the information contained there. But now people at Pearson are awfully happy that they've got them because they're going through and they're just swiping it and they're through. And that is 70% of the people going through Pearson are using those. That's what's reduced greatly the wait times. There's been some more officers. But if you take that example of kind of a part of the vision of Beyond the Border, see that development. It takes a while to get there. And here's another element of that. It was the Airport Authority that paid for those machines that work for the advanced passenger, the APC machines. Private partnership in this endeavor too. And that's an important part of it. People work together. Pearson Airport's interested in having this thing work better. So are folks at CBP. So are the airlines. And here you now have this result. And I think it'll get better. I think we'll have more people with Nexus cards. If that happens and you start getting lines, they'll put more Nexus machines in. The idea is that's the kind of thing we would like to have on the land borders and elsewhere. And then I think it's just kind of worth mentioning the agreement that Ambassador Dewar was at, and he'll probably speak more about that later, and we can talk about it. But the pre-clearance agreement, as you know, the pre-clearance agreements existed for decades, covering air travel out of certain airports in Canada, and there's also some in the Caribbean, and I think Ireland participates now. And the thought is, why can't we use some of that for the land crossings and the water crossings and the rail crossings? Why is it if you're on a train, passenger train, you've got to go through such a long process at the border when you don't have to in a car if you have a Nexus card? So that was out there as an early get when they announced Beyond the Border. Thought was that could happen in 2012. Why is it taking so long to get there? Again, we have to understand some of the big issues that have to be dealt with when we get into these agreements. And this had to do with, again, you're saying, the country is saying, people from, law enforcement from another country, in this case, the U.S. saying from Canada, can come on our territory and conduct law enforcement operations. We're saying the same. we've been doing that somewhat in terms of Pearson. There are limited authorities. This agreement expands on that, and I think gives more room for more creative solutions for not just law enforcement, but for all of our authorities and bureaucracies to leverage where, just like Shipwriter, you can bring people together and make a more common kind of use of personnel. But it's looking at taking that vision. And I tell you, I watch the news reports and I'm frightened of raised expectations, because they're showing the bridges full of cars, and the idea is that somehow or other it's now tomorrow it's not going to be. And they're showing the trains, and they're kind of like in the ferries, and it's like tomorrow you're going to be able to just get pre-cleared and go across. The progress that happened at Pearson, that's based on a number of decades of experience. It's based on a new focus on investing in technologies and extra officers. You think about CBP, if they are going to do pre-clearance on rail, ferry, whatever, where are the people going to come from? Do they just immediately pop up? There's a lot of difficult slog to go through to get this right. And that's where I think we have to be careful to kind of explain that from both sides. But the other important part is to not to lower expectations, not to keep people thinking that this was never going to happen. Because I've been in the engagement part of diplomacy, we call it public diplomacy, my whole career. And I have struggled with how do you sell beyond the border to the public? Because it's iterative, it's not headline inducing often. You've heard what I've said here. Thank you for staying awake, but it's not that exciting, right? It's just kind of stuff where bureaucracies slog through things and then get to some solutions that do have real impact on people. But it is a process. Again, I'll end on this. It is a process that I think we all will look back on in 10 years and say, the two countries took a real chance on each other, and a real chance on, could we change those bureaucratic cultures? Could we find those improvements? And it's because we have expectations that our movements can be easier and more logical, and that we can use technology to basically say, you in this room are all trusted people, and you should be able to travel through, and we will then use our energy to look for people who are not trusted. We will not forget, because what I talked about here mostly was about the trade facilitation or the movement facilitation, but we won't forget that there is a security component to beyond the border. We still need to be vigilant about the security of who's coming into our countries and what they may intend to do. And as we share that information with each other, as we work towards that, and it seems to me that beyond the border, what it does, it takes what has happened, has happened between Canada and the United States. Port directors always talk to each other on the bridges. There's a formal requirement to do so and a reporting up mechanism. That just leverages a habit that was there. That's the kind of thing that beyond a border structure does for the U.S.-Canadian relationship as it goes forward. I'm going to stop because I think we've got some great other folks that are going to speak, and then we're going to have a discussion.
Thank you.
Yeah, let's. Here, you guys sit there, and I've got a stool here.
No, I got Jim. You're in a chair. I got a.
No.
You're the honorable. I'm not.
That's not so. Okay, let's get on with this. I just want to introduce to you David Jacobson. For those who have not had the pleasure of meeting him, I think, David, this is your. What is it, your fourth attendance at Coasley?
It's my fourth, but I was scheduled for a fifth, but I got snowed out.
Oh, yeah, we organized that. Let me give you a little bit of a rundown on David. He went to Georgetown Law, where he was an editor of the Law Journal, then went on to practice law in Chicago as a partner of one of their biggest firms and gained the reputation as being, and I quote, a whip-smart lawyer. David was a great community leader. He founded Atom Works, which brought together corporate, civic, and academic leaders to promote nanotechnology in the Chicago area. He was a member of the CEOs for Cities, 75 mayors and other leaders to deal with the whole competitiveness issue of the Midwest and so many other things he was involved in, including being a Democratic fundraiser. David first met Obama in 2003 at a fundraiser in the House and thrown by the famous author Scott Thurow. They connected later on, and David became what was known as a mega bundler. He formed the Lawyers for Obama.
Is that good?
He was appointed the Deputy National Chair for Finance for the Obama campaign, where he obviously excelled, and after the victory went on to run the Office for Presidential Appointments, which had to deal with about 5,000 orders in council, as it would have been in Canada. And David, I always like to think that in that position of great power, you reserved for yourself the ambassadorship to Canada.
He pulled a Dick Cheney is what he did.
Now, just in terms of the accomplishments, Dick has certainly outlined the great achievements of Beyond the Border, on which he worked, but I'll just quote Colin Robertson, who said, "The deal would not have been struck without Jacobson's work behind the scenes. He had clout. He could get through to the White House." Great credit to Ambassador Jacobson. And to me, one of the greatest achievements, and one I worried a great deal about when I was Minister of Trade, was the second crossing at Detroit, Windsor. Our situation was so vulnerable when we were dependent on one little structure, which was really the aorta of the Canada-U.S. economic relationship. And let me just quote someone from the office of Governor Rick Snyder about the efforts of Ambassador Jacobson. He provided a critical link at the U.S. federal level, which was instrumental in moving the bridge project forward. And I know that Jim Blanchard was very much involved in this as well. And lastly, from my point of view, during his few years in office, two-way trade between Canada and the United States increased 43%. And that's 2009 to 2013. In every one of those years, except for 2011, when there was a very small surplus, Canada was in deficit, big deficit with the United States. And this is probably why David was awarded the Sue M. Cobb Award for exemplary diplomatic service. David has gone on to become the vice chair of the Bank of Montreal, an incredibly good appointment. When he was a fundraiser, he also had the title of FOO, F-O-O, Friends of Obama. I would like to give him a new title for the work he did and the friendships he created in Canada. It's called a FOC.
Be careful with that.
An F-O-C.
I would say I've been called worse, but I'm not sure.
Friend of Canada, and I like to add GFOC, a great friend of Canada, David Jacobson.
Yeah, okay, go ahead.
I think that my name is Jim Blanchard for the record. I co-chair with Jim Peterson, our advisory board at the Canada-U.S. Law Institute. And I think we're going to have a panel react to Consul General Dickmeyer's comments. But before that, I think I should let you at least respond to, this is your life, David Jacobs.
Yeah, right. Let me start by saying this is like my 4th or 5th time here. I was supposed to be here one more, as Ambassador Dewar will remember. We got snowed out. But I came the first time because my friend Governor Blanchard asked me to come, and when he asks me to do something, I do it, because if I don't, he'll ask me again and again and again until I do it. I have come for the next 4 or 5 times because it really is a joy, and I look around the room and I see so many people that I know and so many people that I work with over time. It is an honor for me to be here. It's an honor for me to sit up here with everybody else named Jim. Jim Dickmeyer, who you heard earlier about his distinguished career, but I can tell you, we always send our best people to Toronto, and that's the truth. And Jim carried that out for the last 2 years that I was there. He was the Consul General in Toronto, and he did great work, and we worked together very well. Jim Peterson, Jim Blanchard, John Melly from last night, who I worked with extensively in connection with trade matters, this being the largest trading relationship between 2 countries in the history of the world, and in particular, Ambassador Dewar. I was listening to Consul General Dickmeyer's comments about beyond the border and regulatory cooperation and the bridge and on, and none of those would have taken place without Ambassador Dewar. There were hundreds of telephone calls back and forth between himself and myself about each one of those, and it's always a joy to see him. The Consul General said that he stole lines from me, but we looked over at each other, and one of my regular things, we spoke together constantly, and one of my regular things was that we had spoken together so often that we knew each other's best jokes. First, got the good ones. So I'm here first, and you're going to later on, but it is great to be here, and it's an honor to be up here with all of you.
Well, thank you, David, Your Excellency, anyway, the Honorable. But I've had the privilege of working with all 3 of these gentlemen, and in addition, Ambassador Dewar, Consul General Doug George, John Melly. I mean, last night, for those of you there, we have a star-studded lineup. I think we want to have a little bit of dialogue and turn it over to the audience in comments, preferably questions. But let me just say, because we talked about the border, and it's funny, in 1980 we had a working group for a smooth border accord between the U.S. and Canada, and we found out that the Canadian and U.S. agencies, their counterparts, got along better than the U.S. agencies did with their related agencies, and the Canadian did with theirs. So it was really, turf is always more than ideology, party, or even sovereignty. Turf is the order of the day often, and to play through that is one major achievement. I agree with you. It may sound a little boring from time to time, but it's where the rubber meets the road. And as we're talking about the border, you mentioned the bridge, of course. Without your help at the White House, our new international trade crossing would not have moved along. And clearly, with the leadership of Ambassador Dewar, was a Herculean effort. Both of you know I've worked on this even longer, although not with the decisive influence you've had in recent years.
Not true.
But I do want to acknowledge Andy Doctoroff, who's here. Raise your hand, Andy. Andy is Governor Snyder's legal advisor and policy advisor on the new international crossing. And our governor, our Republican governor from Michigan, my friend, still within hours of having taken the oath of office as governor to embrace the new bridge and get it done and make a deal, make an agreement with Canada. And the Prime Minister was there, The ambassadors were there. It was a glorious moment. But I thank you, Andy, for all your, like, you know, detailed work and policy advice and all the things with the governor that have moved this along. And so I'm glad you're here, so I can say that and people can see who does the work behind the scenes. So thank you, Andy.
Well, thank you, and thank you, Governor Blanchard, for your ongoing help with the project,
Absolutely.
which is deeply valued by the state as well.
Thank you.
Thanks to all the gentlemen in this room and women everywhere who contribute to this, you know, joint effort with true feelings of partnership.
Yeah, but we really do appreciate it. I hope you'll extend our thanks to the governor.
Certainly will.
I would love to hear some of the details of how you people colluded to deal with Mr. Maroon and the problems you had to overcome, which slowed down that process so much.
Yeah, well, that's a long story. All I can tell you is he's had over 40 lawsuits, and he's lost every one, and he's still got some, and he's going to lose those. What's interesting is, as some of you know, Matty Maroon, the owner of the Ambassador Bridge, a dilapidated structure, I might add, and a choke point, frankly, in our trade, which is why we need a new bridge, an additional bridge. But he actually got on the ballot a proposal to require voter approval of any new bridge in Michigan. Spent over $40 million. The no side, our side, spent like $1.5 million, and he still lost 60-40. Every editorial writer in the state of Michigan supported the new crossing and the Canada-U.S. position and opposed Mr. Maroon. His ballot proposal would have had no legal effect. It would have had some sort of political effect. But the bottom line is it's full steam ahead, Jim, on that bridge, and we're delighted for that. I don't want to have that hijack this conference, but as many of you know, like Larry Herman knows, we've talked about this year after year. The one question that you may have is, why can't the U.S. put more money into it? There is money in terms of there will be money. In fact, I think Ambassador Dew will talk about it. The reality is that we are putting money in. There's been a presidential permit. There's been exemptions for Buy America. I'm gonna let the ambassador talk about it. But the reality is, in the U.S., our Congress is not funding infrastructure these days. They just aren't. And this would be an ideal time to raise the gasoline tax with gas prices so low. And you could do so much that's needed, but they're all afraid to kind of do it, which is foolish. I remember raising the gas tax as governor of Michigan. I got almost no heat doing that for roads and bridges. So that's the problem. Once we start putting major amounts of money in infrastructure, then I think the U.S. can put some money in the Border Crossing Authority. It's the crossing authority that's running this. I think there's been some misinformation that perhaps Ambassador Dew will talk about. But anyway, we're moving on from that. Let me just do this. Let me ask you, David Jacobson, now that you've been out of the position of ambassador for, what, a year and a half?
Yeah, I've learned how to drive all over again.
Yeah, right. What are your thoughts here? What comes to mind? Let me ask you, the Keystone thing has really kind of hijacked the press coverage, but this is such an incredibly multifaceted relationship. What are your observations right now, sitting in Chicago and Toronto and everywhere else?
Well, look, there are obviously a couple of issues that we don't agree on, or that there's some friction on. Keystone probably first among them. I understand the problem. But there's a whole heck of a lot more that we do agree on. The line that I used to always use was, and I don't think anything has changed since I left, is that I don't think there are any two neighboring countries anywhere in the world that would not trade their problems for our problems. And I don't think we should ever lose sight of that. You know, I have this job now where I work for BMO, and I go back and forth regularly, all too regularly, between Chicago, where I live, and Toronto, where our headquarters is, and other places in Canada. And if anything, it just reinforces my view as to how close the two countries are. And sometimes we got issues, sure we do. That's inevitable. We've got two sovereign nations, and our interests don't always exactly coincide. But whether it is the personal relationships, whether it is the business relationships, whether it's the political relationships, the relationship is amazingly close. I was in Florida a couple of weeks ago, and everywhere I looked, there were people with Canadian flags flying out in front of their houses. So it's an exceptional relationship. I'd also say the thing I reflect back on the most is the fact that the 4 years that I was in Canada, that my family was in Canada, I think all of us will say were probably the 4 best years of our lives. It was an extraordinary experience. I love being back at my home in Chicago. I love what I'm doing now, but that was a very special time, and I miss you all.
Well, you're loved, I know that. Bruce Heyman, our current ambassador, is in Vancouver. He wanted to be here, but he Vancouver long ago, just for the record.
So you got me instead.
For the record, as they say in Canada. But we had, of course, Consul General who can speak for the U.S. here. I don't know what you, I'm not even going to ask you about Keystone. Let me ask Jim Peterson something. The Canadian election is going to be in October, right? Federal
Yes.
election. So how does that affect the dynamics of these different issues that for example, it would certainly appear that Prime Minister Harper has been a driving force with the new bridge. But he's got to deal with other issues too, Ukraine, the Middle East, Keystone, of course, but country of origin labeling maybe. I don't know. How will all that affect the election dynamics?
Well, the bridge, as all of us know, was so important. And when I was the minister, I had the Prime Minister form a cabinet committee to deal simply with that issue. It was headed by Anne McClellan. This government's priority, and it's one I agree with in a certain way, has been to get our Alberta crude oil from the oil sands to eastern markets. And this has involved the Northern Gateway. You know a lot about this because you're a director of that company. And it makes so much sense from Canada. It makes so much sense that we have to do it. But so far, attempts to go through Kitimat and ship it to China have failed very badly, and I think are dead. And I think I said this last year here. It doesn't mean that there aren't other alternatives. One is going to be using Port Rupert or some other port farther north. There is also the Eastern Pipeline, which could take the distillate or whatever all the way to the East Coast, St. John's, for refining and then shipping. That is certainly not the preferred route to getting to China. These are, Keystone XL has been a big setback to Canadians. There's no doubt about it. And whether it's going to go the way of the Mackenzie Valley Pipeline, which met obstacle after obstacle after obstacle, and still that natural resources locked in the north of our continent after years and years. I can't say. Our government has made, and I know that Ambassador Doer will talk about this later, has made great efforts to get Keystone XL going. And I look forward to hearing what your feelings are. I don't think that's going to be an election issue in Canada. I think the election issue is going to be around a very hard turn to the right government versus those people who want to take a more moderate stand, such as law enforcement, etc. List of issues which are going to come out. We have seen how Justin Trudeau has taken the Liberal Party from 18% in the last election to over 36% in the polls. it's going to be a very interesting contest.
Jim,
And I'm talking too much, but
no,
the major issue is always underlying going to be economics.
can I just say a couple things about Keystone? First of all, I said earlier I always stole Ambassador Dewar's best lines. His very, very best line was one time we were talking about Keystone, and he said, it would be easier for us to put a pipeline in from Canada down to Texas to ship Crown Royal than it would to ship the oil from the oil sands, which I'll never forget that day. But on Keystone, look, I'm not going to sit here and say it should be approved, it shouldn't be approved. I'm not paid to worry about that one anymore. But the one thing that I can say without fear of contradiction, I think, is it shouldn't take 8 years to make up our minds. And this is a subset of a much bigger problem, certainly that we have all over the United States, and quite frankly, I think Canadians suffer from it as well, which is both the decisions about whether or not to build infrastructure and how to fund them are just too slow. There is, in my mind, there is no issue that is so complicated that it should take 8 years to decide. Maybe it's a good idea, maybe it's a bad idea, but we live in a very competitive world. That's one of those things I've learned since I got out of government and into the private sector. And if we're going to compete, we've got to be able to move a little bit more quickly. And I think Keystone is just, in this relationship, the most visible evidence of a much bigger problem.
Yeah, no, and let me just say, too, I can be a little more free on Keystone because I'm many years removed from representing our government. I am on the board of directors of a competing company to TransCanada. So I could say selfishly that we will benefit if it's turned down. But I don't want to see Keystone turned down for the wrong reasons. And I think I've never seen an issue so lacking at this point in serious substance hijack a debate between our two countries, and frankly, the debate on climate change. I mean, it's become the bright line on whether you care about climate change rather than the fact that it's not one of another pipelines. There's like several millions of miles of pipeline in North America. It's not like this is new. And by the way, oil from oil sands have been coming in, and heavy oil from Canada for over 25, 30 years.
In pipelines.
Yes, in pipelines. And the oil there has equivalent or even cleaner components than oil from Bakersfield, California, or Mexico, or Venezuela. So this thing has gotten way off the track here, and has no business becoming the test for our president on climate change. It's a tragedy. The energy story in North America is one of the greatest stories of our lifetime. We've gone from what we thought was going to be shortages to, frankly, we're awash in oil and natural gas and hydro. Renewables are growing. If we want, we will be self-sufficient by 2020 or 2022 with all of those, with natural gas replacing coal, cleaner, renewables growing, and the technology on oil and natural gas getting cleaner and cleaner. It's a great news story, and I wish our president would make the story, make the speech. I've asked our Secretary of Energy about it. He agrees it's a great news story. He said, well, that's why we're having panel discussions. I said, yeah, but this is huge, and in the centerpiece of that is Canada-U.S. cooperation. And as an American, I can tell you, we are very lucky to live next door to you complainers and whiners. That's No, we are. We are. Enough said. I know we should go to the audience for questions and comments, and we have some time for that. Why don't we do that, Ross?
Ross. This is Ross Hornby. Ross was our ambassador to the EU at the time when we signed the CETA. He had to corral all those members of Europe to sit down and make a deal with us. A very distinguished diplomat and a great...
Okay, well, thank you. Not quite. I was there when we launched the negotiations, but that was a difficult process, as you can well imagine, because the EU didn't really want to negotiate with Canada at that time. But I now work for the General Electric Company in Canada, and I actually have a question to the panel on the border and on the application of technology to the border. And, you know, I have an Nexus card. I use it. I love it. It does save time at the airports and even at a land border crossing. But quite frankly, that is very old technology. And there's technology out there now that can really rapidly improve border crossing or just about anything. We have a pilot, General Electric, right now with LED lighting in San Diego, where it's going to tell the passenger or the driver in a car where there's an available parking spot. It will automatically deduct the parking fee from that person's account. And it will also, and here's a little bit of Big Brother, send him a speeding ticket or if he burns a red light. And this is all from a street lamp. So, you know, we're talking about making the border work more efficiently, but we're not really using the latest technology. And that technology, of course, does raise, as I mentioned, these issues around privacy. Most people don't realize that everything they do can be monitored from a street light. So when are we going to wake up and actually apply the latest technology to issues like border crossings? And I don't know who is the right person to answer that. Maybe Consul General Dickmeyer, but can talk a little bit about whether our bureaucrats, as you were describing, are really aware of what is truly possible.
So I think what we'll do is we'll find out how well GE does with the public when they see the Big Brother aspects of this, because you know you actually have hit something that's important on all of this stuff in technology and tracking people and using. So even the chips, the whole debate that went on with the passport chips and then the chips that are in the Nexus cards and so on, can people read our data and this and that? There are lots of kinds of issues that are still out there about that old, the RFID kind of technology, the radio frequency stuff. What I'd say is that while governments will often get usually correctly called on the carpet for not being very innovative or not approaching new technologies, I think what you have in this process of Beyond the Border are, as I mentioned, top cover and in certain incentives to try new stuff, more so than you would as a bureaucracy. And so I think that there's openness, and we'll see increasingly that kind of adaptation. But the other thing is that, again, we're talking infrastructure and money. And so even to get where we've gotten in some of these changes, extra Nexus lines and extra people to do the kiosks for them and so on, these are decisions at points to do that. So if you're talking big investment, new technology, like something you're mentioning there, I mean, I think where you're really going to get at this stuff is private partnership. So GE is willing to kind of do pilot projects with the United States on this with their lights. I think we go for it.
Yeah. I don't want those lights shining on me.
I think it's a political decision. This isn't, you know, it's not like they aren't aware of advanced technology. Part of it is cost, obviously. But part of it is a political decision, and it's a political decision about where do the people of the United States, where do the people of Canada want to spend their money? Do they want to keep it? Do they want to give it to the government? If they give it to the government, do they want to build a bridge, or do they want to have better technology for Nexus cards and global entry cards? Unfortunately, from at least where I sit, the government does not have enough money to do a lot of the things that it has to do. It doesn't have enough money to build roads, doesn't have enough money to have good schools in some places. And this is just a political decision. You know, we could make Nexus work better. We could have a lot more people at Toronto Airport. But ultimately, it's up to the voters as to who they want to send to make those decisions.
Larry.
Larry Herman.
One of the things that concerns me, and it touches on the subject matter of this conference, is that we are not really engaged in major joint projects, the two countries. And I think of previous eras where the two countries captured public imagination because of major joint projects. Beyond the border is, to a large extent, a bureaucratic exercise. It's grinding along, and the pre-clearance announcement last week was an advance. But if you compare previous eras where we worked jointly on big dreams, there aren't any.
Which ones are you referring to?
Seaway, NORAD, Columbia River Treaty. Go back to 1909, and you've got the International Joint. There was a period in our history where Canada and the U.S. were engaged in major joint, if I can put it this way, dream-fulfilling projects. The Permanent Joint Board on Defense, the Hyde Park Accords. There was a period where we really were engaged together in big dream-like projects. There aren't any today. I don't know what the answer is. The border is one. Whether that is, an imagination-catching exercise is questionable, but I'm wondering why this era where, since the Free Trade Agreement and the NAFTA, which is now 25 years old, there's nothing between our two countries that really captures the public imagination as a joint big dream project. Why is that?
I can't speak to the public's imagination, but I just don't think that empirically that's accurate. That, for example, last night John talked about TPP. TPP is redoing big chunks of NAFTA and a lot more. And it will probably have a bigger, or certainly as big an impact on both Canada and the United States as NAFTA did. It may turn out to be more controversial or less controversial than NAFTA was.
David, that's not a bilateral joint project. That's a regional.
Well, part of it is, as John explained last night, that is the trend of trade agreements these days. Canada and the United States, work together all over the world in very, very important things. I mean, I think the most visible one, which it came to an end recently, is Afghanistan. Where, and I was there and I saw Canadian soldiers and American soldiers standing and fighting shoulder to shoulder. They are cooperating all over the Middle East. They cooperate in places in Africa. The beyond the border, while it is effectuated by bureaucrats, I'm not sure that's a bad term, but most everything else is too. The same way is run by bureaucrats. It was negotiated by bureaucrats. And so I don't agree, Larry, with the premise that, it may be that people are more focused on the election in Israel or nuclear weapons in Iran or what's going on in the Ukraine, and maybe that's our fault, maybe it's the media's fault, maybe it's our leaders' fault, I don't know. But I don't agree with the premise that we aren't doing big things and doing them together.
Larry, were you suggesting a huge joint project such as Keystone XL?
I think you're too negative, Larry. I do. And of course, I always see the glass as half full. But I was in Ottawa when we finalized NAFTA and helped spearhead the Open Skies Agreement. And those didn't capture any imagination down our way, but they were really important, really important. The new bridge is actually huge, even though, again, may not capture the imagination of people in Louisiana or Georgia, but I'll tell you, on a working level, it's the Detroit-Windsor crossing is the cradle of our cooperation for over 100 years, actually. And it's going to have more impact in terms of tourism and trade and manufacturing and all that than anything else we can do. The other thing, and I think, I'm pleased that Ambassador Dewar is here because he'll probably talk about the sweep of the issues, but my sense is, aside from, frankly, Keystone, on all the other issues, Middle East, Ukraine, you name it, so many other issues, our two governments are working very, very closely every single day. Every agency, every cabinet member, bureau has a reasonably good relationship with their counterparts in the U.S., in Canada, and work very hard. Whether we can come up with a big bang, that I don't know. It would be nice if you had an idea for what that should be. But I actually believe the relationship is very, very good, and that one issue has kind of clouded it, and shouldn't have. But I just think.
Dan.
Good morning. I'm Dan Utso from Dickinson Wright. I was thinking last night, between the excellent comments last night and this morning, comment on how do you sell North America in the sense of selling the business proposition. We're out with companies every day talking to them, not about KXL or a bridge. We're talking to them about the business opportunities presented in investing in Canada or investing in the United States. And what struck me last night is, with all of the focus on the TPP and TTIP, depending on your perspective, and reasonable minds can disagree, but these will be state-of-the-art international trade agreements. And so the question, I guess the $10 trillion question is, what does North America look like in 5 years? Are we still going to be making things together in integrated supply chains between Canada, the U.S., and Mexico, or are our companies going to start looking more overseas and doing their supply chains that way and saying, our companies don't have time to wait for B2B or RCC. And so the real only business proposition left in North America is that we can move goods faster, so we do need critical infrastructure like bridges and P3 expertise that Canada has that we need in the U.S. We need to move energy through pipelines, and stealing another one of Ambassador Dewar's quotes, the number of lawyers that make money per megawatt of electricity grids that are being cited, and then the third piece, and this could be the big idea, is we need to move people a lot better in North America than we are right now. It is now when we get companies to invest in Canada-U.S. and we can't get people across the border. So what are the prospects for something like a trusted employer program? Because that is a North American competitive advantage where we can move people quicker and faster than anywhere else. Thank you.
That's a tough question. You can answer it, Dick.
It's actually a very good question, because one of the things I thought about mentioning in my talk was an example in which the Beyond the Border process brought in stakeholder comments. There have been, in my time since 2012, people talking about a trusted employer program. This January, DHS announced that they're going to start a group that's going to look at launching a pilot towards a trusted employer program. This came from stakeholder input. It shows that, again, Beyond the Borders giving that umbrella capacity for these kinds of innovations and this kind of input. How long it'll take, it's all too slow for business, I understand. But I think we just have to look at that as, let's keep putting the pressure from the stakeholders to make it faster and better. But the idea now of having and they couldn't use the word trusted for employers, they had to use known. So worthy maybe, I don't know what it is, but it's known employers, and that'll launch. And let's, let me talk about a program we have in the State Department with a visa, part of our visa system, in which we do something similar like that right out of the consulate in Toronto. And an e-visa is for a treaty trader, treaty investor, and someone who's invested down in the United States. Company registers their top staff who need to go back and forth all the time can come in. They're registered. Any of that staff can come in and one day get an e-visa to go back and forth. And they have the board. We worked with the folks at the border, and they recognize an e-visa. And that kind of common problem when people arrive at the border and say, "Where are you going?" "Well, I'm going to work." Sirens go off and they're immediately taken to secondary and so on. With an e-visa, that doesn't happen. So there are steps already in place.
Can I, on the sort of the broader picture of kind of what's North America going to look like in 5 years, or 10 or 20, and my guess is probably no better than anybody else's. But one of the things that I see, and I'd kind of be interested in John Melly's view of this because he knows more about it than I do. But in a few years, we will have, I believe, the Trans-Pacific Partnership Agreement, which will, in significant ways, link Canada, Mexico, and the United States to Pacific trading countries. And the United States will have a trade agreement between itself and the EU. Canada will have a trade agreement between itself and the EU. Mexico has an agreement between itself and the EU. Those are three different agreements. Somehow, particularly given NAFTA, they will have to be deconflicted. But it strikes me that the three North American countries in an incredibly strong strategic position as the bridge between the other two great trading blocs in the world. And you know, particularly right now, the economy of the United States is the strongest of any place in the world. It is the idol of every place in the world. First time I came here, probably spent a good chunk of my time apologizing for how bad things were in the United States. Everybody was sitting there going, oh, you guys are through, you know, you'll never come back. Didn't turn out that way, and it never will. But I view this as an incredibly strong strategic position if we can get all these things done.
You know, the other I want to mention, too, and I agree with that one. Back in 2009, the auto industry was going down, down, down. And Ford Motor didn't appear to need help, but they would have gone down, 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 and as well as their suppliers if something hadn't happened. Our two governments moved in on that one. It's true that because of Senate rules, the Congress never passed a rescue, which they should have done. But between the President of the United States, and our government, and the Canadian government, and the Ontario government, together the three rescued the auto industry. And we can argue about how many jobs and plans and what models are made. But the truth is, it worked. It worked. But people in the U.S. don't know that Canada and Ontario ponied up support. It wasn't just the U.S. government. It worked. Thousands of jobs were saved. Billions of dollars of welfare were saved and spared. The industry is humming along now quite nicely, and it's little noticed that it worked. And it was Canada-U.S.
We've got about 5 minutes. One more question, maybe? If not, let me say this. Jim Dickmeyer and David Jacobson, I think, have shown and demonstrated this morning incredible knowledge, incredible understanding, and incredible care for the Canada-U.S. relationship. How fortunate we are to have people such as this in public life. Thank you both very much.
Thank you. And I think we have coming up in a short while a panel on intellectual property and international exhaustion. So that will be in just a few moments, as I understand it. All right.
5-minute break.